Robin, I think it's important for us in terms of what we've been doing historically to define African history over time, all the way from our early civilizations to the present. We've done it in a very, shall we say, historical fashion in terms of dates and movements of people and governments. I want us to kind of go back to first principles and go back to how our Nile Valley civilizations were developed. Since we know that, you know, the origin of man was certainly in Northeast Africa and also probably in Southern Africa. I'm not sure how you distinguish those two, but certainly the sort of Rift Valley type thing, which is fairly extensive. And that was something going back, you know, shall we say 150 to 200,000 years. So there's a considerable development period within the continent as well as our migration outside of the continent. But essentially, though, the first human civilizations were created in Africa. You know, whether we call them initially Ethiopia, Nubia, Kush, what name we call it from there. But then as they migrated down the Nile Valley into Kemet, or what's being called Egypt today. And that's a civilization that we have most of the artifacts from, more extensive than the earlier civilizations. So, and I think, you know, the things that are important in terms of discussing, let's say, spirituality, because I think spirituality is essential when we're talking about Africans, African history, African culture, African traditions, because we're a people who I think understand the primacy of spirit in terms of our native being, and that we're made of the spiritual and the physical, and the mental is in between, shall we say, transmitting the spiritual to the physical. So it's important for us then to look at our spiritual history, and certainly the pyramid texts, the coffin texts later on, but the pyramid texts initially were in the sarcophagi, etc., and in the burial places of the shall we say, the dignitaries of the Egyptian civilization from way back 3000 BC. Certainly we know that they're the earliest spiritual and philosophical works in the entire world. Can you take us a little bit through that in terms of pyramid texts, how they were found, where they were found, etc., etc.?
The
pyramid text up with a discussion about spirituality and religion, and as you end up with that.
Certainly. Yeah, the pyramid texts, they date back to the period of the 5th ruling dynasty in ancient Egypt. And the very first pyramid texts appeared on the walls of Pharaoh Unas. And Pharaoh Unas is one of the 5th dynasty rulers. Now, we divide ancient Egypt's history into the Old Kingdom, which is dynasties 1 to 6, Middle Kingdom, which is dynasties 11 and 12, and then New Kingdom, which is dynasties 18, 19, 20. So dynasty 5 is very far back. And you've got all kinds of estimates for how long ago that was. Some people say that was 4,000 years ago. Some people say that was 6,000 years ago. And what the pyramid text charts is Pharaoh Unas's passage into the underworld. You could call it the netherworld. And ultimately, he ascends to join Ra. And that became one of the original beliefs of what would happen to you in your afterlife. You would aim to join Ra. Ra is, of course, the sun, or the spiritual power behind the sun. And as far as we know, the pyramid texts are the oldest body of religious writings in the world. And at the same time, there were writings by a very famous ancient Egyptian prime minister, and his name was Ptah-hotep. And his book is called The Maxims of Ptah-hotep. And there was a book that was published in the early 1900s where they called it the oldest books in the world. There was a guy called Myers who reproduced the writings of Ptah-hotep. Now, Ptahhotep's philosophy was about the importance of doing Ma'at. And Ma'at, she's a goddess that represents truth, that represents the law, that represents justice, that represents righteousness. And Ma'at, she's sometimes shown with wings. And so with wings, this is where the Western world came up with the idea of angels. She's also representative of the scales and the scales of balance, and this represents justice. And the European concept of Libra, which is also the scales. Libra has evolved into Lady Justice. So in many European countries, you'll see justice represented as a blindfolded woman holding out a sword, and then coming off the sword are the scales, the balance, which represents this balance of between right and wrong, and as a way of symbolizing justice. And these ideas the ancient Egyptians had certainly as early as the 5th dynasty. The 5th dynasty is where we can prove they had the ideas because they're on the walls. And then from there, the ideas evolve through the coffin texts, where the same writings are now on coffins. And then by the time we get to the 13th dynasty, we start to see new texts coming out. And these new texts are adding to the frame of reference that eventually becomes known as the Book of the Dead. Some people call it Peret Emheru. Peret Emheru is coming forth during the day, coming forth by day. And this is how the ideas develop. Now, what the early African civilizations, and the oldest two were Nubia and ancient Egypt, they realized that religion can be a very, very important tool of building civilization. And it does it at the state level, it does it at the individual level. And so with religion, spirituality is, if you like, a quarter of a religion, giving the inward expression of a religion. Rituals give the outward expression of a religion. Ethics is then the code of what is right and wrong. And futurism is where the religion will tell you what will happen in the future or what would happen in your future. And the ancient Egyptian and Nubian tradition has all of this in there, represented on one hand by the pyramid texts and on the other hand by the maxims of Ptahhotep.
Mm-hmm. I think, you know, that's very informative. Yeah, I think also that traditionally over time, the shall we say the cosmogony and the cosmology of the universe and how Egypt itself developed, and then how human beings are developed, meaning on the evolutionary scale, as the highest evolutionary animal or manifestation of the divine, was also being taught at you know, at one of these 4 centers. Certainly, we know that at Hermopolis, what was one, Heliopolis was another one, certainly Memphis, and then Thebes. And if you look at Hermopolis, where we're taught, or Tehuti, the wisdom deity was supposed to be in charge, if you will, meaning and of course that simply means understanding the basis of creation and creativity. And this is something that we have as a cosmology that the West doesn't have, because the West begins with the Big Bang theory. And all of a sudden, you know, there's this explosion, and there's an explosion, and matter is created in nanoseconds or what have you, but nobody knows what happened before. That does not exist in terms of Western scientific understanding. Everything starts then with the creation of matter. And let's say that was, what, 12 billion years ago or something, you know, of that nature. But, you know, we go before that, and we say before that, we had what's described as Hermopolis, which is those 8 figures, shall we say, in the primeval Nu, which is kind of the watery substance out of which all creation came. and we have no and non-et. And again, we see how we have the opposites, the unity of duality. We don't have one versus the other. We have no and non-et, which really means formlessness, and then form. We have hey and hey het, which means infinity and eternity. But then you can get space-time. That's the opposite polarity. You have Kirk and Kirket, and which is darkness, but darkness gives rise to light. Again, you have the polarity of that, and then you have Amun and Amunet, which you have consciousness of self and consciousness of things. So this is the beginning, shall we say, of creation, and out of that then came Amun, Ra, and Ptah, and Ta is the intellectual principle, and so on and so forth. And then if you want to kick in here, because we need also to go to Heliopolis as the next step.
Yeah, the idea of the Hermopolitan cosmology, as they call it. This is the idea that there were 8 primordial ancestors represented as male-female pairs. And why male-females? Because males and females represent potential, and the potential is the potential to reproduce. And that reproduction, then, as you say, Nun and Nornet, Hu and Horhat, Kuk and Korket, Amen and Amenet. And what comes out of these are things, finiteness, light, and visibility. And these ideas had a big impact on later civilizations, as we shall see, because when the Guyanese philosopher, Professor George G.M. James wrote Stolen Legacy, he noticed, wait a minute, don't some of the ancient Greek ideas sound a little bit like this? And that was a big thing. And then when scholars looked at, well, what were the ancient Egyptians at the city of Heliopolis, the city of Ra, what were they teaching? And they also begin with the primeval waters of Nun, and then Ptah comes out of it, and Ptah coming out of it representing stability. And then we've got Atum Ra, representing the sun, and then Atum Ra creates 2 elements, Shu, air, Tefnut, water. So what have we got? We've got, and then out of that comes Geb, earth, Nut, some people say sky, some people say fire. So you've got earth, air, water, fire, sky. And again, when the ancient Greeks come on the scene, they're running with that. And then we have the most important thing that comes out of that then is when people look at Greek philosophy, a lot of it is looking pretty similar in a lot of ways to what the ancient Egyptians had. And since many of the Greek philosophers spent a lot of time in ancient Egypt. Greetings, my name is Robin Walker. I'm also known as the Black History Man. I am perhaps best known for my 2006 book, When We Ruled. Based on this book, I'm launching a new online history course aimed at you, the adults. You could be a parent, you could be a teacher, a mechanic, cleaner, professionals, care workers, security guards, taxi drivers, kitchen workers, entrepreneurs, tech heads, lawyers, all of you. We want people from all over the world to be empowered by our content. We want you to gain mastery over your history and heritage. And you can do this by subscribing to our course. Click on the link to get this powerful, life-changing material. Then you've also got what's called the Memphite cosmology, where it starts with the deity Ptah and his power and spirit running through all things, animating all things, where he is the divine artificer, the divine potter. And if you look at the images of Ptah, he is shown like this, holding his staff. And if you look at the European American award ceremony, the Oscars, he's shown in the same way. So Oscar is based on Ptah. And then what came out of these ideas at a much later date, you had Thales claiming that water was the source of all things. You had Greek philosopher Anaximander claiming that the origin of all things is the infinite or the unlimited. You had Anaximenes claiming that all things came from air. and Heraclitus teaching that fire is the underlying element in the universe. So in other words, all the ancient Greek philosophers did at the very beginning is just repeat what their ancient Egyptian teachers taught them. Now, for me, there is another lesson that I think the Black community needs to get with, and that is the importance of Thoth or Tehuti, and that's this. There's a branch of European scholarship called the Hermetica. And the Hermetica is the teachings of the god Hermes. And Hermes, as you know, is really a Greek version of the ancient Egyptian deity Tehuti. And the teachings of Hermes, they've evolved into what they call the 7 Hermetic principles. And the 7 Hermetic principles is the basis behind wealth and success philosophy. I've done some research into comparing, for example, the book Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, which is one of the preeminent success books. As a thank you for visiting our website, we are giving you a free copy of our exclusive 100 Black History Facts, which is in fact a taster of our course content. Make sure you leave your email address and we will send it right to you. We hope it inspires you to dig deeper into your history and heritage. And you can see the 7 principles of Tehuti running through all of it. Even ancestralism is in that book, surprisingly enough. So one of the things then that people used ancient African ideas for, they used it practically as a success philosophy, as an achievement philosophy, as a you can do it philosophy. And you'll get people in areas of sports, industry, literature, creativity, using these principles as an aid to building success. And I think a lot of Black scholars dismiss the 7 Hermetic principles, the 7 principles of Tehuti, because they think, oh, well, it's been contaminated by European thought, but it's actually proved to be quite a useful body of information as well.
I think it's also the basis of that whole business of creativity. There's that whole the secret, what they call the secret, and the secret is simply really self-knowledge, which was the basis of all these 4 institutions that we're talking about, back there in Egypt, 3000 BC or what have you. And it's a way to get to your source, because as you go through the whole thing, like for example, in terms of Heliopolis, I mean, you have Atum Ra, which is the will of God, and then as you mentioned before, you have Shu and Tefnut. I interpret them slightly differently. I interpret Shu as fire, Nut as water, and then Tefnut as the air or movement or expansion, and Geb as contraction or matter. However you look at it, basically those are the principles within space, which was created by Atum Ra. And then of course you go to the evolutionary aspect of it, where you end up then also now as with many different things. That's where Ptah comes in, and you end up with Auset, Seth, Nephthys, and Heru. And that's how you end up with the 9, these 5, which are, so you end up with these, 9 principles, which tell you all about evolution, and it also tells you that you're made in the image of God, because Atum Ra is what produced you, and he produced you as his highest product, and you are able as Ausar to be one with Atum, which is the sort of one God, if you will, that is hidden. As you know, Amun means hidden, and Atum means the will. So see, these are all principles of divinity that we also possess, and that's the secret that is embedded in Kemetic cosmology and cosmogony, which, as you're saying, I don't think we understand enough of it as African people, but it's being applied by Europeans in these ways of success, growing rich, and the secret of life in terms of creativity. And that's what we have as African humans. When we are in touch with our inner selves, we have this creativity that comes out, and that mirrors the creativity of the universe. And that's told when you go to Thebes in terms of the origin of time and the beginning of this whole cycle. One cycle that ended, I forget what the name of the serpent was, Erta or something like this, and then a new cycle, started when this new serpent was broken open, shall we say, which is inertia, and then time started again for this new cycle. So we have this understanding of the universe, the creation of the universe, the source of the creativity of the universe. How it came from consciousness and energy to matter, and all the principles that are behind it, because in all of this, Ma'at is the basic principle behind creation. And this is what human beings have to aspire to. And as you know, why don't you take us through the business, shall we say, the death scene of the individual who goes into the hall of justice. He's going to get his heart weighed, and Ma'at is on one side, the feather in terms of the scales, and his heart has to balance this feather. So he has to be a disciple of Ma'at, or he will not, go to the next phase, which is a higher form of life.
I think we missed something out, which I'll put in, and then we'll get to that if you don't mind.
Okay.
This is what it is. The Book of the Dead is a journey where you're tested and tested and tested at the behest of Osiris or Osar. And those tests are gruesome, and you have to emerge triumphant, and you have to stay righteous while you're being tested. And then the final test is when you then arrive at the Hall of the Two Truths. And what happens is you enter the hall. This is what the mythology says. And then you address the 42 judges of, and you say the sin that you didn't do. So people call it the negative confessions. I have not done iniquity. I have not stolen. I have not told lies, that kind of thing. And eventually you get to Osiris. Now, the judgment is where you've got Ma'at, who represents the female, and the male equivalent is Tehuti or Thoth. And Thoth is shown with a writing board with everything that you've ever done in your life written down. And what happens is you're judged. And the idea is, in the balance, your heart has to be as light as a feather. Now, what does it mean for your heart to be light? It means you have not got a sinful and heavy heart. And this idea of a sinful and heavy heart, it's almost like your heart and the feeling represents, if it represents heaviness, it means you've lived a guilty life. And so your life has to be, your heart has to be light so that it can symbolically balance something as light as a feather. And then the feather is one of the feathers, we said that Ma'at is shown with wings. One of her feathers is then put in the other pan, and the two have to balance. And that symbolizes you having to live a righteous and therefore a guilt-free life. And if you can go past that, then that means you have emerged righteous. And that symbolizes, if you like, victory. That symbolizes, if you like, success, according to how the ancient Egyptians saw the world.